Welcome in the latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Bratton, and that is not Cousin Shay. That is our good friend, Steven Lassan, senior editor over at Athlon Sports. Give him a follow at Athlon Steven. Steven, how's it going, my man?
Mike, it is good to be back. I missed you guys, hanging out with you guys last week, finishing up the Athlon Sports college football magazine. So excited to be back and excited in a few weeks to have the magazine in hands on print in the newsstands.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I wanted to lead the show with Steven. So we are going to be talking quarterback, not necessarily quarterback rankings, but SEC schedule ranks based on the quarterbacks that each team's going to be facing this fall. So you thought it'd be a little bit different. But before we dive into that, Steven, can you give us what is the latest update with the Athlon Sports College Football Preview Magazine? Because I know for myself and so many others out there that I know we've kind of turned this into a year-round thing anyway by now. But for a lot of people, college football has you don't get that itch till you get that Athlon Sports Preview Magazine in your hands. So I'm dying to get an update, get that magazine in my hands.
Good news, less than a month. It should be on newsstands in less than a month, a couple weeks here. You know, for me, it's always been sort of like the unofficial start of the season. Like once you get that in hand, the preseason, it's right around the corner with fall practice. So about a month from now, I would say it's going to be widespread, probably a little bit earlier most places. If you're a fan of the SEC, I think about 9 teams will be on covers this year. It's more regionalized than before, but yeah, it's a pretty in-depth process now more than ever with all the transfers scrambling at the last minute to get things in the magazine. But in I would say less than a month, be checking those newsstands and athlonsports.com for places to order the magazine.
Well, I can't wait, Steven. And I wonder if this is Paul Feinbaum. I don't think it is. But cousin Paul down here says, why doesn't Steven have a couch like cousin Shay? But we may need to upgrade your couch seating for this show.
This is like the hostage situation back here. Just a plain wall and a light and a couple computers down here. So yeah, send over a couch if anybody's got one to give.
All right. So again, Steven, we're going to be talking SEC schedules here in terms of facing the quarterbacks. I'm very interested to talk to you about this in particular because I'm not knowledgeable on some of the non-conference quarterbacks. So I think your list will be a little bit different than my list. So that'll make it a little bit fun. But I did kind of preview before we jump into that real quick. There have been some big transfers. I know the second portal window is a little overhyped. Not a ton of movement here. But one guy that we hit on the last time you were on the show about what was it, 2 weeks ago? We talked about Auburn landing Penn State receiver Keandre Lambert-Smith. And then since that time, some other big ones have landed. Oklahoma landed TCU defensive lineman Dominique Williams that apparently has sent Brian Kelly into a tailspin here. We ain't paying players, what they want to get paid, yada, 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 even though I make $100 million. I must be awful to be an LSU Tiger. Texas landed San Jose State cornerback Javion Cole, and Ole Miss landed Houston quarterback Isaiah Hamilton. And specifically, Stephen, from what I know, these are 4 impact players. You would know better than I because they're coming from outside the SEC. I'm just kind of curious if maybe you could quickly rank these guys in terms of the impact you think they could have on the field this fall.
Yeah, I think the number one transfer here is Dominic Williams from TCU to Oklahoma. I wouldn't expect him to put up a ton of stats at Oklahoma. And I mean that in a good way. Like he's a guy that's going to be over 300 pounds in the middle of this defense for Oklahoma. I think if you're an Oklahoma fan, really have to be encouraged about the overall additions this year on the offensive and defensive lines. It's 2 groups that got to get better in the SEC. I think so far, mission accomplished this offseason. I think the offensive line's obviously the storyline here. But Dominic Williams is a guy I think could be a real difference maker. I mean, for me, he was going to be one of the best defensive linemen in the Big 12 this year. I think he can be on all SEC ballots as we go through the offseason. So without a doubt for me, if we were to redo our top transfers list, he would rank very high because I think he can be that much of a difference maker for this defense. I think as far as the defensive backs there, I think Cole, Javion Cole for San Jose State, I would probably rate him a little bit higher than Isaiah Hamilton, largely because of need. And I think when you're looking at this Texas secondary, they lost Terrence Brooks to the portal. It's a position that struggled last season. We saw this in the Sugar Bowl against Washington. Malik Muhammad is a guy that Texas really needs to step up at cornerback. So I think getting somebody who's got, some high experience, starting experience at San Jose State, because honorable mention All Mountain West last year, I think he could be a nice piece to that secondary. Same thing too with Hamilton. I mean, Ole Miss has so many transfers here. I think this looks like to me like a good kind of solid, another kind of depth addition piece for that defense.
Oh, shout out real quick, Steven. Cousin Brandon gave us $5, and I don't have Shane to hit the button here, but let's see if I can do it. Yeah, so appreciate you, cuz. But and then again, you've already hit on Keandre Lambert-Smith, but just such a need for Auburn right there that it's hard to imagine he doesn't make a big impact for the Tigers this fall.
Yeah, I screwed up already. I should have had him number 2 behind Dominic Williams. I was so excited to talk about some San Jose State and Houston cornerbacks. Look what I've done. Yeah, I think for Auburn, you think back to last season, how inconsistent the passing game was. And it's multi-layer. It's quarterback, it's offensive line, it's coaching, it's receivers, the drop passes, like the quarterback and receivers need to mesh. And Keandre Lambert-Smith's a guy who was a multi-year starter at Penn State, nearly 700 receiving yards last season. So all of a sudden you change out your receiving core to be Cam Coleman, potentially Robert Lewis, the transfer from Georgia State, and Lambert-Smith, and you have a much improved group of receivers. So I out of that 4, I would put him 2 behind Williams and have him ahead of Cole and Hamilton at defensive back.
Mm-hmm. All right, Steven, so let's get into our show topic because we're going to hit on all 16 SEC teams like we love to do on this show. And what we're doing, again, we're kind of ranking the schedules based on the quarterbacks that you'll be facing this fall. I just thought it'd be a little bit different. I've not seen anybody quite rank the schedules this way. So that was kind of my idea for this. So,
and it's your idea too. It's this is like most time,
yeah, I finally came up with an idea. Steve is usually the idea man on this show. So how do you want to do it necessarily, Steven? Do you want to start maybe at the most difficult, or do you want to start at the least difficult? I'll let you pick.
How about we start at the bottom? Let's start with the easiest.
Okay, yeah, because I'm fascinated to see if your list matches mine. So, which schedule, which team has got the easiest path when we're just talking about quarterbacks that you'll be facing? Who is the least difficult on your list?
Well, I have to admit that I have a little scientific formula for this process because I'm such a nerd. So I went through and I ranked all I used my spring quarterback rankings and put 1 through 16 beside every team and added up where they totaled out to be. So Missouri actually ended up at number 16 in the totals. So this is a kind of an easy call for me as far as which, the easiest quarterback slate faced. It kind of mirrors the easy schedule that Missouri faces this season. They face one of my top 7 quarterbacks this season. That is Jalen Milroe. Not a ton of difference really once you start talking in some of these tiers, but Jalen Milroe, they don't play Carson Beck. There's no Quinn Ewers on this schedule. They also play, I think, 3 of the bottom teams in terms of quarterback situation in the SEC. Non-conference wise, BC's Thomas Castellanos is probably the best of that group. UMass, Murray State, Buffalo, all fair. I think to say not ones that probably move the needle much in quarterback, but Castellanos from BC, kind of a dynamic, kind of dual threat guy who could cause some problems for Missouri's defense. But I think this is pretty favorable for the Tigers.
Yeah, you know what, Steven? That's exactly who I've got on my list as the easiest too. And again, I try not to just kind of go off of, overall schedule strength, but A lot of the points you made there too. I mean, we don't even know who Vanderbilt's starting quarterback is going to be necessarily. We assume Diego Pavia. So Connor Wigman. I hope he's a breakout candidate in Colin Klein's offense, but again, I think he's flashed enough to where he's a solid quarterback, but we've not seen him for a full season. Peyton Thorne, again, I don't want to bash a guy any more than I already have. Jalen Milroe, up and down. We haven't seen him in this offense. Jackson Arnold, we're hoping that he's awesome, but that ain't a given. Not as he's a start. Lenore Sellers, we just announced him as our starting quarterback for now, but then Shane Bieber turns around and says, "What? Robbie Ashford's going to push him." Blake Shapen. I think Blake Shapen will be solid but again, I don't know how good Mississippi State's going to be. And Jalen Green, Sam Pittman may not even be the head coach by this point in time. So I think Mizzou is kind of an easy answer here.
I think if you use my highly scientific formula on how to rank these, at least I think 5 quarterback situations that I think you and I agreed were kind of after 10 in the SEC. And you can kind of quibble with where you have 1, 11, 12, or 13, but Missouri plays 5 of those. And they have a Buffalo team that is rebuilding. A lot of questions at UMass, a totally revamped receiving core there as well. So I think for a defense that has some questions coming into this year, I like a lot of the pieces. How does it all come together under a new coordinator? That's probably about as good of a schedule as Missouri could be facing for a defense with those kind of preseason question marks.
Right. This is my first opportunity, Stephen, to use my new graphic layouts here, throwing tons of numbers at people. But yeah, to the point you just made, I mean, explosive pass, Mizzou was 108th in the country in allowing explosive, which is passes of 20 or more yards. So again, there's a lot of turnover on Missouri's defense. They added some key transfers though, that is going to help. So, but again, I'm feeling pretty confident if I'm a Missouri Tiger fan.
Absolutely. And I think too, one of the interesting things of going through the magazine process and sort of looking at position by position for all these teams, I think what Missouri might give up on defense this year, they can probably gain it offensively. In that the defense may regress some, but the offense has a chance to really take a step forward. So, I mean, you and I have talked a lot about how things align for Missouri to make a playoff run this year. It really does. Schedule, high-powered offense, and some favorable matchups in the SEC for a defense that does have some questions.
Right, and obviously in today's modern era, I mean, you want a great defense because that'll win you some ball games. But and I'm not saying Missouri's defense is going to be poor or anything, but I'd much rather have an elite offense than I would an elite defense. Than vice versa. That's where I'm at with this game's at. But all right, so how about number 15, Stephen? Who would you rank as the 15th toughest schedule in terms of just facing the quarterbacks they got to face?
I think for a defense that is under pressure to improve this season, the schedule really breaks in favor for Ole Miss. So I got the Rebels at 15 here. When you look at their schedule for this season, I think I would say maybe consensus top 6 quarterbacks in the SEC, Carson Beck is the one that they'll get. They do have to play Jackson Arnold. They get Garrett Nussmeier as well. But from a non-conference standpoint, MTSU comes into the season with one of the better quarterbacks in Conference USA. Not sure that's going to be a huge test, though, because of some of the other pieces that Middle Tennessee's losing. Wake Forest has a new quarterback. Georgia Southern's got a new quarterback. So I think their schedule non-conference wise really shapes up well. And like I said, outside of Carson Beck, if you look at just the numbers in the SEC, I've got them playing 5 of the lower rated quarterback situations in double digits. So from 10 to 16, they get 5 of them this year. That's a good situation for a team with a lot of questions on that side of the ball.
So you're telling me, Stephen, that Furman does not have a All-American quarterback?
I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that you put Ole Miss here, Stephen. I put them. I got one team. Well, I'm sure we'll get to them in a minute at the 15th spot. But I'm right there with you because I got Ole Miss at the 14th spot. I like everything that you said again, and we're getting a lot of inexperience here as well with Vandergriff right out the gate, Lenora Sellers. South. I mean, I'm just looking at the SEC, of course, but even Garrett Nussmeier, I know he started some, he's played, but Jackson Arnold, Taylor Green. I mean, the most experienced in terms of SEC, again, Carson Beck and Graham Mertz, they've only started one season in the SEC. I know Mertz is at Wisconsin, but I don't consider that major college football, believe it or not. But again, yeah. So again, we talk about Ole Miss path to the college football playoff, and at this point, I mean, it's just we're not saying anything, too revealing. I mean, I've gone from playoff team to national championship type team, and this is another one that Ole Miss, in particular, against explode. I've got them as the number 108th defense in the country last year against explosive passing plays, which is 20 or more yards. So I expect this number to go up significantly when you're talking about adding guys like Princely from Florida to help get to the quarterback. Trey Amos from Alabama came in, Key Lawrence, among others. I mean, I think Ole Miss defense is going to be a lot better, but it's going to help that they have so many inexperienced quarterbacks on the schedule.
I think I count 7 new play callers on the schedule for Ole Miss this season.
Ooh.
So opposing teams that they're playing, I count 7 new offensive coordinators or play callers this year. That's a pretty good break for all the reasons that you mentioned there. I like the potential for this defense to be better just almost by default because they're the pieces that they're adding. Second year under Pete Golding, but the schedule is also going to help them a ton this year because they're playing a lot of inexperienced quarterbacks and new play callers in there.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even think about that, Stephen, but that's a fantastic point, and why I call you the CFB encyclopedia over there. All right, so who you got number 14, Stephen?
Mike, I've got Texas. I was debating between Texas and Ole Miss for 15. One of the things that kind of swung my opinion to put Texas up a notch was their non-conference schedule. I don't think Michigan is a huge threat, in terms of quarterback play right now. They exited spring with a question mark. UTSA and Colorado State have enough weapons at receiver. They have some good quarterbacks too. They can cause some problems. I'm not saying they're going to pull off the upset, but I think they're a much harder matchup than playing MTSU and Furman, if you will, on that schedule. So there are a few challenging non-conference quarterback and receiver matchups there for Texas. But you look in conference play, Connor Wigman and Carson Beck and Jackson Arnold, obviously. But this is, I think, one of the more favorable slates for a team making its way into the SEC. So I've got Texas at 14.
Yeah, fascinating because this is about – I had them 13, so we're about right there. Like-minded, great minds think alike, Stephen. But one thing I really like when I went a step further here, the better quarterbacks are not in true road environments, in my opinion. A Carson Beck, a Graham Mertz, Jackson Arnold, if he breaks out. Now, the exception there, possibly Connor Wigman and Jalen Green. But again, if you're telling me, Stephen, that the 2 toughest quarterbacks you got to face on the schedule on the road are Jalen Green and Connor Wigman, and I guess throw in Diego Pavia there if you want. But again, I think that's quite favorable.
Yeah, absolutely. And to go back to what we were kind of mentioning with some of the transfers they brought in, for a team that does have some question marks in the secondary this season after giving up a lot of yards last year, and what happens up front too after you take away Byron Murphy and T'Vondre Sweat, to get the top matchups, with the exception of Connor Wigman, you also have to go play Oklahoma in Dallas, but getting Georgia at your place, I know Florida's probably going to be ranked 9th or 10th in the quarterback rankings, but still getting them in Austin is huge. So I think just from a home quarterbacks face, the entire schedule, there's no Milroe, there's no Jackson Dart. That's pretty favorable for a Texas team that does have some concerns on defense coming into this year.
Yeah. Hey, shout out cousin PJ here. $10. I appreciate you. Hook 'em, PJ. I've always been a Longhorn at heart here. And again, they're another one, Stephen, that they were dominant last season against the run, And look at that. I mean, third down stop percentage, number 2 in the entire country. Here's the sad thing, Texas. You'll get used to this being in the SEC. You were number 2 in the entire country in third down stops. You're number 2 in the SEC because Georgia was just that much better. I
Yeah.
mean, Georgia's just a machine. But the one glaring issue here, explosive pass, 108th in the country. So again, but that should improve with getting some of these key transfers. Trey Moore from UTSA, right? So elite edge rusher. We already talked about San Jose State corner Cole. Mabuka, or is that how you say? Is that from Clemson? Is an elite transfer? I mean, you're adding pieces to shore this up. So combine that with a schedule that is very favorable in terms of the quarterbacks you're going to face. If I'm a Longhorn fan, I'm sitting there saying our defense, maybe one of the most underrated ones in the entire SEC next season.
Yeah, my biggest concern for this defense is, and they tried to address that by getting Bill Norton and the other Arizona defensive tackle, is how do they fill the shoes? And it's probably impossible to do of Murphy and Sweat. I mean, those guys stuff the middle of the defense, and they sort of need help on the interior and off the edge. And I think Trey Moore, with his ability to get off the edge quick, will be a valuable asset for that team. You and I have also talked to, I think Jahdae Barron is really going to be a player to watch for Texas because he's very versatile in the secondary. Might have to step in and play some corner after some of the losses that they have, kind of a nickel versatile player. So I think they have the talent and they have the pieces to be better. It may look a little different this year because they're taking away the 2 big tackles, but I think their defense is going to be fine overall as we get deeper into the season.
So who's next on your list here, Stephen?
I've got Tennessee at 13.
Oh, I like that.
Speaking of good news for a team that needs it with a questionable secondary, right? I mean, at the very top here for Tennessee, I think the thing that jumps out to you is if you think Jalen Milroe and Carson Beck are the 2 best quarterbacks in the SEC, and you can debate that and throw Quinn Ewers in there and Jackson Dart, but Tennessee gets those 2. Outside of that, I mean, the next best quarterback on the list is probably Jackson Arnold. Graham Mertz is solid as well, but there's a pretty big drop off in the quarterback, using the quarterback rankings here to describe Tennessee's schedule. And of course, Chattanooga, Kent State will be one of the worst teams in college football this year. Same thing for UTEP. They're really catching a break there. The one to watch is that game against NC State. NC State has one of the best offensive lines in the ACC, much improved receiving core, and they brought in Grayson McCall, the Coastal Carolina quarterback. I think that offense for NC State will be a difficult matchup for Tennessee in week 2.
Yeah, the more I hear about that game, the more nervous I get about it because I think the vast majority of Tennessee people are just completely overlooking NC State. I would imagine that just based on what I'm hearing, again, I'm not very knowledgeable on NC State, but they could be a preseason top 25 type team. So that's going to be interesting. We'll see how good Jackson Arnold is. But I had Tennessee a couple notches up. There's still 2 teams that we haven't hit just yet that I think a little bit easier. And again, maybe I'm buying into Blake Shapen a little bit. I'm buying into Taylon Green on the road. I'm buying into Jackson Arnold on the road. So again, a lot of inexperience. We're seeing a lot of that when we're going around these SEC schedules because we lost some prolific signal callers off a lot of these teams. But I'm right there with you. I think Tennessee in the top half of the easier schedules when we're just talking the quarterbacks you're going to be facing. And again, that's going to be great because we're not bringing back anybody that was in the secondary here. So you're going to need that pass rush to really come through, particularly in a game like at Oklahoma early in the season on the road against Bama, against Georgia, against Florida, on and on and on. That pass rush has got to be there because there's no telling how good or bad this secondary really is.
I was going to say, I think it's good for Tennessee that they get Alabama and Florida at home on the flip side, playing at Oklahoma and playing Georgia on the road probably balances that out. Like there's some good, there's some bad there for Tennessee. But, I know Tennessee fans are probably going to be tired of hearing about the secondary, but I think for me, the defense is really the one group that decides whether or not they make the playoff because the SEC is loaded with quarterbacks this year, standout quarterbacks, even quarterbacks that I would put 12, 13, 14 in the league, I think are going to be really, really solid this year. So how the secondary comes together with all the new pieces is going to be one of the bigger storylines. On the positive side, this defensive line, I think, could be one of the top 10 in college football this year. And that's not something I don't think you could have said about Tennessee in the last couple of years. This line looks really, really solid to me on paper.
Right. All right, Steven. So who's next on your list in terms of easiest path? We're just basing this on the quarterbacks you're set to face.
I've got Texas A&M. Largely moved them up the list a bit because they get Notre Dame in the season opener with Riley Leonard, the Duke transfer. A&M also, or Notre Dame was also very active in the transfer portal and adding weapons at receiver. We should also note, by the way, that old SEC friend Deuce Hogan comes back to the conference. He could be New Mexico State starting quarterback on November 16th. I know some Texas A&M fans might worry a little bit about New Mexico State after they won at Auburn last year. I don't think that this is as good of a New Mexico State team as it was last year. But overall, on this A&M schedule, there's no Quinn. They have to play Ewers, they have to play Nussmeier, Brady Cook. There's no Milrow, and there's no Carson Beck. So some good, some bad, but I think this is I have them 12th come into the season.
All right, so this is one of the ones, Steven. I had them just a little bit easier than Tennessee, but again, this is why we got you on because you're so knowledgeable. I forgot all about Notre. I didn't even know who Notre Dame's quarterback was, but you jogged my memory. It's the Duke transfer, which again I don't know much about him, quite frankly, but I watched him smack Clemson last year. That's what I remember.
And Mike Denbrock is offensive coordinator too.
Oh yeah, so I mean he was the engineer of LSU's offense the last 2 seasons. So again, yeah, I think you're dead on here. I think A&M's gets significantly tougher when you consider that. Graham Mertz again on the road. I don't think that's going to be easy. I think Talon Green again, not home, not away, neutral site. That ain't going to be easy. But Brady Cook, I don't think he'll be phased as good a home field as Kyle Field is. So now we're starting to get into some tough ones. But the last, aside from Quinn Ewers, Arch Manning, whoever it is, come November 30th, that last stretch there seems very manageable. Again, outside of that Texas game. So again, I still, as do you, I agree. Texas A&M should be in the easier half of the conference, but we need Mike Elko to have an impact here because this defense, they're not awful, but they certainly took a step back without Mike Elko roaming the sidelines there, and of course he's back. But a lot of transition too. That secondary, basically the same thing we said about Tennessee. This is close to an entirely new secondary within a new system. It's not a given, but I've got so much faith in Mike Elko. I think they'll be fine there, but again, it's not a given that they're going to be locked down on defense right away.
Yeah, I think that's the optimism you have to have if you're Texas A&M is that the players coming back, there's enough talent plus portal additions plus the Elko sort of magic touch to get this defense, performing at a higher level. And I go back to what Mike Elko did at Duke in his first season. And last season, their record and their stats are a little skewed because Riley Leonard got hurt midway through the year, and then he was never the same, and then he missed the rest of the season. So it's a little hard to read into what they did at Duke, but Duke in his first year was one of the most improved power conference teams I can think of in the last couple of years because they were so bad and David Cutcliffe's last year, and then they were so much better the next year. I think he can make that kind of improvement in year one where they can improve by a couple wins. It's a lot harder in the SEC, but I think you'll see Elko make an impact this season. And with those pieces on defense, I think they're going to be better on that side of the ball too.
And just such a unique situation because he's been there, obviously not as head coach, but coming back, He's familiar with a lot of the inner workings. I would imagine he's familiar with a lot of the players on both sides of the ball. Again, with the way college football is now, I mean, it'd probably be a different story 10 years, even 5 years ago. There wouldn't have been as much roster transition, but I would have to imagine the vast majority of the players he inherited, he already had some kind of rapport with them. So this is going to be a unique challenge, but I think the best way that I've seen it described, Stephen, is, and I think this is probably coming from even just you and I talking, but just we need a coach that's just not going to get in the way.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what we've had clearly the last couple of years down in College Station.
It's almost like you just need a blue-collar, hardworking coach that isn't going to be spending the offseason running his mouth. Like, I don't think you're going to see Mike Elko running his mouth all that much. I think he's just going to put the work in. And I really think that's what A&M needs. Like, it's almost like they have like all the ingredients for the cake on the counter. Somebody just has to put them all together, to use the Nick Saban analogy there. And I think Elko's experience plus his track record at Duke gives them the right ingredients to try and turn this thing around.
Now, the one thing I would disagree with you there, Stephen, I actually liked Jimbo running his mouth, because basically the teams that he called out, those were like Alabama. Those were the games he actually showed up and coached and did a good job. It was the other games where it didn't seem like he really cared too much. Even against Ole Miss last year, they showed all kinds of life, and I think because Kiffin was trolling them. Yeah. But had he given that effort, he'd probably still be the coach down there.
I'm gonna miss the Lane Kiffin Jimbo Fisher feud, aren't you?
All right, Stephen. So who's next on your list here?
I've got LSU. This is a defense that I am very, very interested to see what happens this season. There is I think, idea that this defense from a production standpoint was obviously very, very bad last season. They still have a lot of talent on the roster. I don't think they have enough to make a drastic turnaround, but I think there's enough there to where there should be some improvement this season. They tried the strategy of reloading the secondary through the portal. Didn't quite work out the last 2 years. They've kind of whiffed on the best defensive lineman in the portal this cycle. So really interesting setup for first-year coordinator Blake Baker. But on the positive side, you look at the schedule, it's pretty manageable. I mean, they've got Jackson Dart, Connor Wigman, Jalen Milroe, and Jackson Arnold. But Florida, Vanderbilt, Arkansas, South Carolina will probably be rated in probably the 10 through 16 range for quarterback rankings. Not saying those are going to be easy, because I do think guys like Blake Shapen and certainly Graham Mertz are going to be solid. But I think in the non-conference schedule, they get Nichols. You look at also South Alabama with a first-year starter. UCLA and USC are also in rebuild mode. USC has major questions at the line of scrimmage. UCLA, new head coach Eric Bieniemy, the former NFL assistant, is their offensive coordinator. I think UCLA will probably be picked at the bottom of the Big Ten this year. So non-conference is manageable. There's no Carson Beck on this schedule for LSU, and there's no Quinn Ewers and Brady Cook and Nico. So they get a couple breaks there by missing some of these quarterbacks.
Yeah, I mean, LSU's just so hard for me to figure out, Stephen. And like Cousin Thomas says, LSU defense will be bad, and then Jeffrey says LSU will be 12-0. I mean, this is the feeling here where it's all or nothing. And if those are my options, I'm leaning more towards nothing, Stephen. Again, I realize they've completely reworked the defensive staff, but these numbers are just atrocious. And one of the things I hate more than anything, because there's no logic to this, Stephen, but I'm sure I'm guilty of saying this. Everybody's basically guilty of saying this, is, well, we can't be any worse. That's an old cliche, but it's not true. I mean, you can be worse. And based on, rumblings that, the new position coaches are not happy. They're missing guys in the portal. Again, I'm not guaranteeing they're going to be worse, because they're damn near the worst defense, not only the SEC, but the Power 5 last year. So you certainly hope they're not worse. But I don't have any confidence that we're going to be much better, or at least significantly better on the defensive side. And I have a great deal of confidence that we're taking a step back on offense, which the offense was historically good, obviously, but you're losing the Heisman winner, number 2 overall pick, 2 first round receivers, running backs transferred out. I mean, it's illogical to sit here and say we're going to be this good on offense again. So we're going to take a step back here. I just don't get the confidence in. Again, I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but I don't understand the love for LSU.
While you were going through that, I wouldn't say tangent. I think it's a lot of good points there. I was writing down, do not say it cannot be worse this offseason, because I'm pretty sure I've said that a time or two on your show. But I do think if I was trying to make the case for optimism, it would just start with, hey, the defensive staff is better. They've got to use all the pieces better. Harold Perkins can probably be deployed more correctly, better coaching this season. It fixes some of the ailments from last year. I do think from a personnel standpoint, and I was mentioning this to you before we started, when you look at just returning personnel in the league, tell me on LSU's defense right now, outside of Harold Perkins, who you would put in the upper half of like first or second team honors in the SEC. And I don't know there's going to be many guys in consideration. I certainly think the secondary's got a lot of concerns. And, from a defensive line standpoint, we know they're still actively looking for, able defensive interior linemen in the portal. So I do think there are a ton of questions here. And I think maybe the conversation is, what's the baseline that this new staff can generate improvement from, as opposed to expecting this defense to go to one of the best. I don't think the personnel is going to be there, but maybe the coaching can at least get them from being 13th or 14th to 8th, maybe in the SEC, and some of those numbers that you got there on the screen.
Right. Well, they better, Steven.
Yeah.
Because again, the offense is not going to be nearly as elite as it was last season. And Cousin Sven there, appreciate you. I think that's euros, 5 year. I think that's even more than American dollars. So, boo, appreciate you, Cousin Sven. He said, let's see if a proven quarterback gets a higher grade as a rookie. Blake Shapen or Nico, Hail State. So, Steve, let's address Sven real quick here. Again, I don't think I've said a bad word about Blake Shapen, and I love, you just look at Jeff Lebby's track record. I know Oklahoma fans are out on him for some reason. Again, I'm going to throw up these Oklahoma numbers real quick here, Steven. I know we've been focusing primarily on defense for good reason. But, I mean, my God, look at these offensive numbers here. I don't think people realized how good Oklahoma's offense was last year. We're talking top 10 we got 6 categories here: scoring efficiency, yards per pass, third down rate, and explosive pass. Top 10 in all those categories last year. Now that's our head coach. So I think the offense, I think Blake Shapen, I think there's a case to be made. He's going to be the biggest surprise quarterback in the SEC this year.
I think I'm with you on that one. So I think one thing that kind of stands out to me about the Blake Shapen, Jeff Lebby sort of, kind of marriage for this season is, Lebby kind of handpicked Blake Shapen to be his guy. You don't bring somebody in when you're in a situation like Mississippi State for him to sit on the sidelines this year and cycle through, a freshman quarterback or one of the other ones you have on the roster. So he sees something in him. I go back to the 2020, I forget if it was 21 Big 12 championship game where he started for Baylor and they beat Oklahoma State in that crazy game where it came down to the goal line, and he was impressive. And I think Baylor's had a lot of things around him that have not gone well, whether it's offensive line or a thin receiving core. I really like what they did in the portal too, at receiver. Coleman, and they brought in Trent Hudson from New Mexico State as well. Trent Hudson and Kelly Akari are 2 guys who can help stretch the field, and Davin Booth, the running back from Utah State. So I think as far as scheme and improved skill talent around him, I think Blake Shapen's going to quietly have a really, really nice season for Mississippi State. I trust Jeff Lebby to get the best out of him.
But will he be better than Nico? Because that is the question.
I'm going to go with no on that one. Yeah.
Steven said it,
So,
not me. So
I,
so this is not a
yeah,
biased response here.
yeah, Mike, this is the hard part about doing like the quarterbacks in the SEC is you're like, man, like this guy's 10th, like he's like a top 25 quarterback in college football. That's a very, very good year for quarterbacks in the SEC.
Right. All right. So we got a little sidetracked. Who's next on your list? And again, we're just ranking the list in terms of quarterbacks that you're going to be having to defend next fall.
I've got Auburn at number 10. From a non-conference standpoint, there are not many quarterbacks for me on that Auburn schedule that are too threatening. Let's just put it that way. California in week 2 is probably the one that stands out. It could be a transfer from North Texas, or it could be one quarterback they had last season. I think Cal. We saw the ugly game against Auburn last year. I think they'll be a little bit better this season, but New Mexico's rebuilding. Louisiana Monroe, I've got as the number 133rd ranked team in the country. That's out of 134. But in the SEC, they play Carson Beck, they play Jalen Milroe, but no Nico, no Nussmeier, Wigman, Dart. I think this is and Quinn Ewers. That's a pretty good schedule for Auburn.
Right, and this is the one I said, Stephen, where I think you may. Again, your list is a little different than mine, but this is the one that I put way down the list because, again, Alabama, A&M, Cal, New Mexico. I mean, I wouldn't imagine any of those guys are going to threaten us. And the toughest ones, although on the road here, no doubt, Carson Beck, Brady Cook, and Jalen Milroe. I mean, I don't know that any of these home quarterbacks are going to threaten us either. So, again, three of these 12 are quite daunting. I will admit that. But in terms of SEC schedules facing quarterbacks, you could do a lot more daunting than this, in my opinion. And again, now, if Jalen Green's a huge breakout star, if Brock Vandagriff is as good as Kentucky fans hope he is, I'll be dead wrong. If Connor Wigman can stay healthy and he looks good in the offense, if Jackson, but again, if this, if that, if this, if that, there's a lot of ifs here. There's a favorable one, I think, for Auburn. And I realize they've had massive coaching turnover here, but they were pretty solid last year in terms of a year one complete turnaround, stopping explosive passes. But there's work to be done here for the Auburn Tigers, no doubt.
I'm regretting putting Auburn at number 10. I think I probably should have had them a little bit lower. So shame on me. I think you convinced me to move them a little bit lower in the rankings. A lot of good things there for Auburn from a defensive standpoint. Like you mentioned, I like the fact that anytime you can get Jackson Arnold and Connor Wigman at home, yes, you do have three very difficult quarterback matchups, three probably top 10 quarterbacks nationally on the road. But outside of that, that's very, very favorable for Auburn's defense.
Mm-hmm. All right, Steven. So who's next on your list?
We have reached the territory of where there's not really a ton of separation between these next group of teams. So I will admit I'm probably off on a couple of these, but I went with Kentucky at number 9. I think the first thing that jumped out to me about Kentucky, I like the upside of Lenora Sellers. I think getting him in week 2 is probably where you want to get him if you're Kentucky's defense. At that point of the season, South Carolina is still evolving offensively. Also, they get Vanderbilt, probably the worst quarterback situation right now in the SEC. Some tough matchups, though, on the road, no doubt about it. Ewers and Dart and Nico and Louisville in the season finale will have Tyler Shuck, a transfer from Texas Tech. So this is a difficult schedule, but I also think you're getting one of your wild cards at the front in Sellers, and your non-conference games, Southern Miss, Ohio, and Murray State, all very favorable from a defensive matchup against their quarterbacks.
Yeah, I'm glad you said this, Stephen, because this is right in the territory. I have one team that I would put in front of Kentucky, but a lot of this is ignorance on my part because I didn't know about Louisville's quarterback, so I wanted to ask you about that. I have so much confidence and faith in Braum that the quarterback could be a complete unknown. I feel fairly confident he'll be solid. But what'd you say his name was? Shuck. Can you tell me anything about him? And I've heard Ohio could. I don't know why, but any insight into Ohio or how good they'll be? Because I've heard they not that that's like a toss up game or anything, but it's basically one where Kentucky better show up.
Yeah, I'll start with Ohio. They're an interesting team because they were pretty good last year in the MAC. They have been hit very, very hard by the transfer portal. I think they're down to 4 returning starters for this season, and
Hmm.
one of their potential starting quarterbacks also transferred a few weeks ago. So I think they just lost a lot. They are dangerous. I think any kind of a team, from the MAC comes into your place, you kind of have to be a little wary of an upset. But I think as far as like upset potential, I'd be much more worried about a few other teams in the MAC if I was Kentucky. On Louisville, Tyler Shuck is a really fascinating quarterback. He started his career at Oregon and then he transferred to Texas Tech. The problem with him his whole career has just been injuries. He just can't stay healthy. When he's healthy, he's been pretty productive. And there's been a lot of talk that he'll be on the radar for NFL draft next season if he can stay healthy. So he's a quarterback with a ton of upside in the right offense under Jeff Brom. I think whoever Jeff Brom puts a quarterback, he can get production out of. And Tyler Shuck is much more talented than Jack Plummer, who they started last season.
I take back everything I said about LSU, Stevie. Cousin Jared, $5. We appreciate you so much. And we also got a tenner from cousin Nick here. Boom! Appreciate you, cousin. He says, hit that like button for all this Mississippi State love, even though Steven hates Jeff Lebby and their quarterback and everything. I do not associate Steven with this podcast, please.
He's just a special guest filling in while Shane's,
All right, who you got next here, Steven?
Mike, I've got South Carolina at number 8. So, this is kind of middle of the pack as far as schedule difficulty. Non-conference wise, obviously the one that stands out is Clemson. Clemson's been up and down in terms of offense and quarterback play. I think we'll see if they're improved. I have my doubts this year. Old Dominion, probably one of the better situations too in the Sun Belt, but also I don't think one that'll really threaten South Carolina in week 1. They do play 2 of the top 5 in Jackson Dart and Jalen Milroe. And then of course, Garrett Nussmeier, Jackson Arnold, Wigman, and Cook. So this is a pretty difficult schedule for South Carolina. I've got them 8th, but I think you can make case they could be a little bit higher.
Yeah, this is the one, Stephen. Again, we're like in sync here. I'm glad you went with Carolina. That I'd put Carolina slightly easier than Kentucky, but just by one selection here. Again, you mentioned Clemson quarterback Cade Klubnik, right? But
Yeah.
I mean, hey, I wish the kid well. I don't like to bury players, but I've never seen anything from him that resembles the hype that we've heard. I'm not sold on Brock Vandagriff. I think he looks the part, but heck, their last quarterback, all I heard all off season was how great Devin Leary was going to be, and that blew up on him. So that should not necessarily be held against Brock Vandagriff, but I think again, I think you're looking at the first month. The only true threat there is Garrett Nussmeier, and I've already kind of said my piece on the step back I think LSU is going to take, but. It's this murderer's row right here, Steven. Jackson Dart, Jalen Milroe, Jackson Arnold, Connor Wigman, and then Brady Cook 2 weeks later. That it is not going to be easy, and I really hate the fact for South Carolina that we can't even get back-to-back home games when we're talking conference play here. We do got LSU, Akron, and Ole Miss in a 3-game stretch here, but I'd love to get some confidence going with back-to-back SEC games, and I'm just not seeing it here. So tricky for South Carolina, but I think a little bit more manageable than Kentucky's slate.
I think the reason why, when you look at Kentucky and South Carolina, you could maybe look at the non-conference games might be your tiebreaker if you're trying to decide like Clemson or Louisville, which one is tougher, might end up deciding which one you like a little bit ahead. But one thing on the schedule, as you were showing it on the screen there that jumped out to me is if I'm a South Carolina fan, I have optimism that LSU will still be pretty good on offense this year. But getting them in week 3, and you're also getting Kentucky with all the new pieces in week 2, with Old Dominion and Akron, if and LSU's a big if, but there's potential there at least to get that for the defense, at least to get off to a decent start. I would think if you're getting LSU early in the season, that's where you want to get them. And the same thing too, I think, with Kentucky.
Yeah, and another thing, I realize this is not what we're kind of ranking here, Stephen, but South Carolina, number 2 in the SEC in returning defensive production, top 20 in the entire country. Again, these are I should have given this guy a shout out long ago, but these are Bill Connolly's returning production metrics here. But a lot of the key returners are in the secondary, and I think that'll certainly help South Carolina. And the secondary was not the issue either. I didn't think. I thought it was more, the offense clearly. But I think South Carolina, if Clayton White, can make the necessary adjustments, could be one of the more underrated defenses in the entire SEC.
I also like the portal additions that they made. They brought back Gilbert Edmond from Florida State. You also look at, Kennard from Georgia Tech. They have some guys who I think can also get after the quarterback this year, maybe a little bit better than they did last season too.
All right, Steven. So who's next on your list here?
I've got Alabama. I think from a off-season news standpoint, we'll see if they add another transfer or two in the secondary. They've been a little quiet there. They've added the transfer from Charlotte. There's been some talk. There's going to be a couple others at least one, maybe two, that find their way to Tuscaloosa. So a secondary that still has concerns. I think what's interesting is those first 3 games. Old SEC friend TJ Finley is probably going to be the starting quarterback for Western Kentucky. He's in week 1. Alex Golesh, the head coach at South Florida. They were so much better on offense last year. They're dangerous. Byron Brown is their quarterback at South Florida, and they can put up some points. Also, Wisconsin, kind of interesting because Tyler Van Dyke is the starting quarterback at Wisconsin. And I think we all might remember what happened, off season ago with the rumors of TVD transferring to Alabama. But they get Carson Beck, they get Nico, and they get Brady Cook. But I think outside of that, and of course the road test with Garrett Nussmeier, but that non-conference schedule for me for Alabama is tricky. I don't think they're going to lose any of those, but they're tricky at least.
Wow, yeah, no, I appreciate the insight because I was completely unaware of that. But so Van Dyke is at Wisconsin now, and do they still have Longo as the offensive coordinator?
Yep, it's an old SEC friend too.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, because I don't follow Wisconsin, but I think they underachieved last year. But Phil Longo, a lot of people credit him for Drake May development and getting him to the NFL, and Drake May took a big step back without Phil Longo last year. So again, that could be tricky, but this is right where I had Alabama as well for a lot of the reasons you mentioned: Carson Beck, Nico, Brady Cook, Nussmeier, Arnold. I mean, these are some interesting guys. And TJ Finley, I didn't even know he was still in college football. Steve, how old is that man? My goodness. And I couldn't tell you one single player that plays for Alex Golesh at South Florida, but given his track record in the SEC, their success llast year, I have a good feeling, that again they're not going to test Alabama again. Well, heck, they did last year, so maybe I should bite my tongue here. But I'd be stunned if they did it again. But the point being is, I would imagine they're going to put up quite a test for a defense that is, under a new regime here, week 2 under Kalen DeBoer.
Yeah, I think the good news for Alabama is your defense in week 2 is probably still going to be a work in progress, and you'll get a pretty good indicator of how it is because this South Florida team can really score. I mentioned Byron Brown, but they've got weapons at running back, receiver. They've got an experienced offensive line. I say all this not to say there's going to be an upset, but we know Alex Golesh before when he was at Tennessee, the trouble that they gave Alabama in that game in Knoxville. They gave him trouble last year. If I'm Alabama and the defense plays well in this game, that would give me some confidence going into that matchup against Wisconsin and also the big one against Georgia a couple weeks later.
And I've got it on the screen here, Stephen. I should probably be shouting a lot more of these out for the audio listener later back. But Alabama returning production on the defensive side of the ball, 33%. that is 126 in the country and 15th in the SEC. Now, this is oftentimes the case, even with Alabama, because they send so many guys to the NFL, and it's. I mean, I don't know that it's ever been this bad, but they are typically in the 100. So I will say that. So again, this is not. You shouldn't look at this and say, okay, Alabama's going to be awful on defense, because they've overcome this about 10 years in a row. Now, of course, they had the greatest college coach of all time, and they have arguably the best roster in the country year in, year out. I don't think it's that caliber this year, but I think it's still probably top 5. Given the fact that this returning production is so low, particularly on the defensive side of the ball for Alabama, and because we got a new coaching staff, a new defensive scheme, does that concern you at all? Or do you think it's just business as usual? Because again, it's the height of stupidity to sit here and say Alabama's roster is in shambles or anything. I think outside of Georgia, maybe Texas, I think every other SEC coach, if he was being honest, would trade his roster for Alabama. So again, this is top 5 roster in the country. Any concern here that Alabama's returning so little on the defensive side of the ball?
Absolutely. I think first of all, like where's who's going to get after the quarterback this year? With Dallas Turner off to the NFL, and then also in tandem with that, how does that affect your secondary? You're going to be able to consistently generate the pass rush. I know Kane Womack has talked about blending the schemes with what Nick Saban did and what he did. You're talking about taking away the greatest coach of all time in college football and his defensive abilities. There's going to be some sort of drop off here. And also, I think if Nick Saban was the coach again this year, I think we would just assume that they'd be. I think there's more questions about where they come into the season. I don't think we would be having that same conversation. We would just assume they would reload. But I think anytime when you're dealing with this much transition, to me, I think there is going to be some sort of drop off or at least concern level that has been rising more so than you would under Nick Saban.
Right. We had Chris Marler on the show last week, Stephen. He said, well, Nick Saban has been struggling on the road. So maybe DeBoer's a better coach than Nick Saban. So better than the best of all time. It's a hot take, but I do appreciate hot takes. All right. Who's next on your list here, Stephen?
I've got Vanderbilt at number 6. We'll start with the season opener. I think the Virginia Tech's going to be a much improved team in the ACC. Kyron Drones, one of the better quarterbacks potentially in the ACC. Old SEC friend Del McGee leads Georgia State on September 14th against Vanderbilt. Georgia State's probably going to struggle this year. So outside of that Virginia Tech game, their non-conference schedule is pretty favorable. But in SEC play, you talk about facing Brady Cook, Jalen Milroe back-to-back. Then you get Quinn Ewers. And then at the end of the season, Nussmeier and Nico. I think this is a very, very difficult schedule for a team that, like you have on the screen there, the over-under is 2.5.
Embrace your eyes, folks. I'm putting up Vanderbilt's defensive stats up on the screen here. But, basically... Yikes is the nicest way to say this, but scoring defensive efficiency 16th last year in the SEC, yards per pass 15th, yards per rush allowed 16th, third down stop rate 16th. I mean, just whoo. Now Clark Lee, he's fired people. He's in charge of the defense now, so hopefully we can turn this around. But with these quarterbacks. Yeah, I mean, you hit it up. Brady Cook, Milroe, Vandegrift, Ewers, Thorne, Sellers, Nussmeier, Nico. My goodness, Stephen. I don't know that many of these numbers are going to be much improved given this schedule.
I also don't think they did enough in the portal to overcome some of their defensive concerns. I mean, I like the fact that they went out and added, I think, 5 defensive backs in the portal this offseason. I think that's their defense on paper. They have a chance for the entire 2 deep, the starting and the backups to be maybe a little bit deeper if all these guys hit than they were last season. But I don't know if there's enough difference makers on this defense to turn those numbers around this season.
Right. All right, Steven, who's next on your list here?
I've got Georgia at number 5. This is a team coming into the season with some question marks in the secondary, at least just to see how it all fits together or how fast all the 5 stars end up hitting for this defense. They get Clemson in the season opener. We talked about with South Carolina. I'm not too worried about the matchup with Clemson. The passing game has been very inconsistent. They are counting on two true freshman receivers to really ignite that passing game this year. We'll see. I'm not sold that Clemson will be able to do that, but also they get Georgia Tech in the season finale, and old SEC friend Haynes King was one of the ACC's better quarterbacks last season up at Georgia Tech. So that's not an easy matchup for Georgia, and of course Tech gave Georgia some trouble last year. But you start an SEC play early in the year. Milrow, getting to play Jalen Milrow on the road, Quinn Ewers and Jackson Dart all on the road, and of course getting to play Nico 1 week after Jackson Dart. There's some tough stretches in there for this defense.
Yeah, and I've got, believe it or not, Stephen, I got Georgia all the way up as the number 2 most difficult schedule in terms of quarterbacks faced, and it's in large part because of those away games, or the way I'm kind of looking at it, fair or not, games away from Athens with at Bama, at Texas, at Ole Miss, and Clemson. I know I buried that guy, but Clemson and Florida, both on a neutral field. So I think the Haynes King, that's a good draw. Again, I forgot about him. I don't think Mario Cristobal will ever forget the name Haynes King because, one of the dumbest coaching decisions of all time. But, aside from Nico, maybe your toughest home quarterback, you're going to face Blake Shapen or Peyton Thorne. So the home game's manageable, but the road games, and again, I hope for Kentucky's fans' sake, I'm dead wrong about Brock Vandagriff. Let's say Brock Vandagriff, Stephen, is a breakout star of the SEC. Then all of a sudden, Kentucky, again, Georgia's going to be favored by 20 points. But that is a little bit more formidable at that point as well. So I think Georgia's got, in my opinion, the second toughest slate here in terms of just the quarterbacks they're going to be facing.
Yeah, those road tests are really brutal. I probably should have bumped Georgia up a spot or two because of how difficult that road slate is for the quarterbacks. I know we're talking about Georgia here, but I keep going back to that September 7th game for Kentucky and South Carolina and just think how important that game is going to be, because we're going to learn a lot about both those teams, the two quarterbacks, how it's going to set the tone kind of for both teams. It's one of those games that's going to fly under the radar nationally because Texas is going to play Michigan that weekend, and there's some other high profile games. But as far as learning about both teams, the September 7th with those two is going to be really fascinating for me.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Whoever loses that game, Stephen, I can't imagine them having a great season.
Yeah.
And I could be wrong, but again, that's going to be a tough pill to swallow week 2 when you're whoever loses that game.
Yeah, the winner gets to wear the Ray-Bans home.
All right, who's next on your list here, Steven?
I got Oklahoma at number 4 here. I think the top 4 are pretty close. I know you had Georgia a little higher. I could buy that. The first thing that jumps out to me about Oklahoma, first 3 games, non-conference, all pretty favorable. Temple is one of the worst teams in the country. Houston has a new coaching staff with a quarterback coming off of a shoulder injury. He had surgery this offseason. And Tulane, new offensive staff, new quarterback. So pretty favorable start to the season if you're Oklahoma. But within SEC play, if you want to look at just pure quarterback rankings, they play number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 from our spring conversation earlier this year. So that's 6 of the top 7. The only one they don't play is Carson Beck. That's really, really difficult.
Yeah. Again, this is somewhat of a murderer's row here, particularly, from October 20. Let's look aside from Maine here, but I think just Dart, Cook, Milrow, and if not, again, I'll be happy to be dead wrong about LSU and Garrett Nussmeier, but we have seen him light up the Georgia Bulldogs. So, yeah, this is a real run here. And again, Nico, if he lives up to the hype, Ewers, any of these non-conference quarterbacks, aside from Maine, of course, but any of these others, have a quarterback worth anything?
I think both Houston and Tulane both have interesting quarterbacks. I think the positive for both of those, if you're Oklahoma, is they're both going through transition. Houston's got a new offensive coordinator. Tulane does as well. Ty Thompson is the new starting quarterback at Tulane. You may remember him. He was at Oregon. He was a high
Hmm.
profile recruit a few years ago. So both of those quarterbacks, Donovan Smith for Houston and Ty Thompson, are talented. I just think that the early season transition will be beneficial for Oklahoma's defense here.
Yeah, and again, if you're not watching later, you're just listening back. Oklahoma returns more on the defensive side of the football than any team in the SEC. 79% of their production. That's eighth in the country. Again, number one in the SEC. But one key metric where they really struggled last year is allowing explosive pass plays, which are pass plays of 20 or more yards. 116th in the entire country. So we got to get this cleaned up coming into the SEC. I'm sure that'll get better. We've changed defensive coordinator to get someone that Brent Venables more on the same page with. They work together at Clemson. So, but they've got to get better here, especially with this murderer's row of quarterbacks they're looking at.
Absolutely. And this is where I think some of the guys they added up front could really help out. You know, Caden Woolard is a pass rusher from Miami of Ohio who could come in and play sort of situationally to get after the quarterback. Dominic Williams and Jermaine Lole, both the guys they brought in on the interior, could add some beef to that front, sort of help take the pressure off the secondary. Oklahoma really didn't make a splash in the portal on the secondary front. You're just kind of counting on guys like, Peyton Bowen and some of the other Billy Bowman to step up this year and sort of kind of take their game to the next level. So it'll be interesting for Oklahoma. I think the optimistic angle ought to be that nearly 80% returning production could translate into more improvement this year.
Mm-hmm. All right, Steven. So are we into your top three now, I believe?
Yep. I've got Arkansas at number 3. I think this is a really challenging slate of quarterbacks. Not the slate you want to have if you're Sam Pittman on the hot seat this year. Let's start with September 7th. Oklahoma State brings back, I think, 20 returning starters. They're one of the most experienced returning starter teams in the country. Alan Bowman is their starting quarterback. You may remember him. He started like a long time ago at Texas Tech. He's the Van Wilder of college football. He's been there like 25 years. Week 3, Jacob Zeno of UAB, one of the better quarterbacks in the American. Trent Dilfer, of course, is the head coach at UAB. So a few challenges early in the season that I think will test this Arkansas defense. But man, you just go down Connor Wigman, Nico, and Garrett Nussmeier all in a row. And then later in the season, you go Jackson Dart, Quinn Ewers, and Brady Cook in the month of November. This is a really, really difficult slate, I think, for Sam Pittman.
And apologies if I missed. I heard you talk a lot of these other guys, but does Louisiana Tech, do they have anything worth at quarterback?
I don't think so. Sonny Cumbie is their head coach. You know, he's kind of
Right.
bounced around as a coordinator. They really struggled last year, more than I would expected for a Sonny Cumbie coach team. I think probably middle of the pack Conference USA offensively this year.
And then Arkansas does not return 115% of their. That'd be pretty impressive if they
Yeah.
did. But the thing I really wanted to point out again, apologies if you're just listening back later, but Arkansas number 2. Remember 2 years ago, Stephen, they were just getting gashed with these big plays in the passing game over and over and over, and that's why fans turned on Barry Odom. But last year under Travis Williams, number 2 in the SEC in allowing explosive passing plays. So they got that cleaned up. They're going to have to continue to get that cleaned up, Stephen, with this these quarterbacks they got coming in here. But yeah, I mean they better hope, and you know they're high on Bobby Petrino, but they better hope that he hits, because they're going to have to win a lot of shootouts, I think, in Arkansas this year.
I think maybe the positive side of this for Arkansas is a lot of those games against top flight quarterbacks do come at home. I mean, if you can get Nico, Nussmeier, Dart, and Ewers at home, that's at least a little bit of a break for a very, very difficult slate of quarterbacks too. And like you mentioned, I think Travis Williams, underrated job last year on defense. And I think with some of the portal additions, they sort of fortified the linebacker spot over the last couple weeks. And with Landon Jackson, also, I think very underrated nationally. I think there's enough here for Arkansas to be maybe a little bit more optimistic than the third toughest schedule in terms of quarterbacks this year.
Mm-hmm. All right. So who's number 2, Stephen?
I've got Mississippi State at number 2. I guess we start with the positive. The non-conference schedule is not bad. Eastern Kentucky, Arizona State lost Jaden Rashada. Looks like they're going to start Sam Levitt, a transfer from Michigan State. Toledo starting quarterback transferred to Baylor. So right off the jump, they get a pretty favorable start with the non-conference. But once you get into conference play, to go back to our rankings this spring, I mean, number 1, number 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, and the bottom 2, according to this, would be Florida and Arkansas. And of course, we saw what Taylor Green did this spring. They miss Vanderbilt, they miss Kentucky, they miss South Carolina. Maybe the teams you would have more question marks at quarterback this year. So I like the non-conference schedule. I think that the SEC slate's really tough for Mississippi State.
Yeah, no doubt. And this is one where got so many graphics here, Steven. I can't find what I'm looking for here. But this is one, and maybe, it's kind of good that this happened, but, we have completely blown up the roster too. So, yeah. Again, we're going to need to win some big-time shootouts here in Starkville. I think we got the right coach to do it, but no idea how that's going to translate to the defensive side of the football. And again, here we go. Boom. 132nd Mississippi State is in returning defensive production, which, say what you want about Zach Arnett, at least he knew what he was doing on that side of the football. So ranking dead last in returning defensive production is not, with the inexperience just in that coaching staff. Again, I know they went kind of crazy in the transfer portal. I hope they hit on a bunch of these guys. But, man, I feel like this is going to be early Tennessee and Ole Miss. And, where if we're not scoring 40 points, I don't know if we got a chance to win many of these games.
Absolutely. I almost think the objective of Mississippi State's defense ought to be just to find ways to create havoc. Like, you're probably going to give up a lot of yards and a lot of points, but if you can find ways to maybe create a couple turnovers a game and get the ball back to your offense, and with the firepower that maybe this offense potentially has, there's your path this year. Like, you're just going to have to acknowledge they're going to give up a lot. But if you just can create 1 or 2 plays a game in some of these toss-ups, that might be enough to get Mississippi State to exceed expectations in year 1.
Mm-hmm. So then, without further ado, Stephen, we all know where we're going. The most difficult schedule ever assembled here. And just when you think Florida, maybe they won't rank number 1 most difficult schedule, of course, they are here. And it's, these quarterbacks, it's that no favors being done to Billy Napier.
No, there's not. I mean, let's start with the non-conference. Cam Ward from Miami is probably the ACC's best quarterback. And October 5th, they get KJ Jefferson in a revenge game after he, played well in Gainesville last season, playing for Gus Malzahn at UCF. DJ Uiagalelei down at Florida State. I mean, they get 3 top 20, 25 quarterbacks in the non-conference slate. I don't know. There's that. I couldn't find another team in the SEC comparable to that. But then you start getting into just SEC play. That November stretch, Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers, Garrett Nussmeier, and Jackson Dart. That is brutal to go with a road game at Tennessee on October 12th.
Right. And again, avert your eyes if you don't want to see something horrible here. But, we all know Florida's defense was not great last year, but then running back in the numbers here, scoring efficiency, 105th in the country was Florida's defense. Scoring efficiency, most important statistic in the game, in my opinion. Yards per pass, Stephen, 124 yards per pass, dead last in the SEC. course, yards per rush, 117th, not much better. But uh, I'm the schedule is all the talk. Billy Napier's the talk, but it's the defense should be the talk, because if this is the same level of production we get from Florida's defense, I don't care who they play. They could have the easiest schedule in the SEC. They're not going to win games playing defense like this. And now that they've got this incredible stretch of quarterbacks they play, and again, a lot of the SEC schedules are similar. So to Steven's point, a lot of these teams, it was kind of hard to differentiate, this one from that one to this one to that one. But Florida, it's on another level with Caleb Ward, with KJ Jefferson, and DJU. It's just, there's no way around just how unbearable this is for the Gators.
Yeah, Ron Roberts has one of the most difficult jobs for any first-year assistant, I think, as far as improving the Florida defense. But also, you look at what they did in the portal, and I think some of the guys they brought in, like Joey Slackman, the defensive line transfer from Penn, Pup Howard from linebacker from South Carolina, they added some depth in the secondary. This looks more like quantity more so than quality here. They didn't add any all SEC guys. They added for depth. And I think you're kind of banking on Roberts plus turning around some of the fortunes of some of the guys already on the roster, like a Jason Marshall. He turns things around in the secondary, and you add in some better depth, and that sort of insulates you against this difficult schedule. I mean, there's really just not a break on here. I mean, we talked about Mississippi State's offense. You have to go on the road to Starkville after you've already played Miami and Texas A&M in the month of September. And, if October 19th against, Kentucky's probably one of the easier matchups the rest of the way, but we know the success that Kentucky's had against Florida recently. So there's really not a break outside of Samford on the schedule for Florida.
Right. So again, nothing breaking. This is going to be the discussion all off season till week one gets here. And again, they better beat Miami, Steven, because Miami is probably one of the more winnable games they got on their schedule. But if they're dropping that one, it's just, you can, even the biggest Florida fans, I think they could see the wheels coming off fairly quickly.
Oh, absolutely. I think on the flip side of things, in some sort of alternative universe here, what if Florida beats Miami, A&M, and UCF at home? And of course they'll be favored over Mississippi State, I think, on the road. There's 5-0 going into the game at Tennessee. Of course, finding some wins after that's going to be challenging because of some of the things we talked about. But it's the Florida schedule and the start of the season could really go. So the variance in how they could play is so wide here, and the implications for what it might mean for Billy Napier and this program and some of the other dominoes in the season. It's really going to be a fascinating schedule for sure.
Could you imagine a world, Stephen, where Florida is undefeated going into Neyland Stadium, and I don't think this is too far-fetched, that Tennessee has 2 losses at Oklahoma and NC State, and then all of a sudden, all this offseason of saying Billy Napier, a hot seat, this, that, and the other. I'm not saying we put Josh Heupel on the hot seat, but if he loses to Billy Napier, who, fans are waiting for him to get fired, that's going to shift pretty quickly to Josh Heupel.
And then Josh Heupel turns around and beats Florida, Alabama, and Kentucky to get off the hot seat, right?
Exactly. All right, Steven. So, wait, we went pretty long on this one. Got any closing thoughts before we hop off?
Man, we've reached the long, cold off season, haven't we? There's no spring practice. The portal's kind of winding down. I guess we have to hit the YouTube and catch some old games and get ready for the season. But excited to be back every week and talking some ball. And like I said at the start, looking forward to getting that Athlon Sports preseason magazine in everybody's hands real soon.
Yeah, and as always, Steven, before you go, can you tell the audience, if they don't know already, how can they follow you and how can they find your work?
Yeah, absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter at Athlon Steven. You can follow all my work up at athlonsports.com. Stephen L. CFB on Instagram and Facebook, all CFB 365 on YouTube as well.
All right, Steven. So, hey, a lot of fun here. I appreciate all the time and effort you put in to making this show a little bit better each and every week. So, can't wait for next weekend. Thanks again, and to everybody out there, really appreciate all your support. Like, subscribe, share the video, do all that jazz. And hey, that's all we got on this episode. So we'll catch you. Cousin Shane will be back on the next episode. But until then, we'll catch you on the next one.